Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'll show you how I painted this Warlord Panzer IV. This is a plastic model in 28mm or 1/56 scale. If you would like to see the assembly video for this tank, there's a link in the description and in the card in the upper right corner of the video now. I painted this model as a gift for somebody that likes their panzers in grey. I hadn't painted a grey panzer for a long time, so I figured why not. Instead of rambling about it any further, why not get to it? I started this by priming the model black. For this I used Stynylrez. It's a good primer, but you can use any primer you like. You could go without primer if you really wanted to, but it's not the best idea to paint acrylics directly onto the plastic if you want them to stay there. Then I apply a base coat of Vallejo Model Color German Grey. This goes all over the tank, because the model is going to be pretty much entirely this colour. I thinned this enough to go through the airbrush and I apply it in a couple of coats. It's good to apply paint in multiple thin coats rather than one thick detail obscuring layer. It's also a good idea to thin your paints for brush painting as well, for the same reason of not obscuring detail and having a nice smooth coat. Moving on, it's time for highlights. I mixed roughly 4 parts German Grey to 1 part Model Color London Grey and applied it mostly from above. I don't want to go too heavily with this, I just wanted to add a bit of lightness and variation to the top of the tank. Also, I didn't want a stark separation between the lighter and darker colours, so I very lightly spray some of this along the top sides of the model too, just to kind of blend them. I then added another part of London Grey to the mix, and applied it quite lightly to the top of the model. This is mostly to add some highlights to things like the hatches and access panels. The result is pretty subtle, but that's the sort of thing I like. Then it's time for some dry brushing. Again, I've used German Grey and London Grey, mixed roughly 50-50. I take my dry brush and apply it roughly to all of the corners and raised edges of the model. There's nothing especially tricky about this, though you might want to adjust the colour mix a bit to your tastes. I didn't want to go too light with it, just enough to bring out the corners and make them pop a little bit. If you're curious about the brush I'm using, it's a contouring brush for makeup. I made a video about this which you can see in the description and in the upper right corner. I then lighten the mix just a little bit, but I'm not quite sure how much. It's probably close to 1/4 German Grey and 3/4 London Grey. I dry brush it on in pretty much the same way, but quite a bit lighter. The idea here is to make the sharp edges stand out just a little bit more, rather than the model looking like one big single colour blob. Then I realised what a numpty I'd been. I had forgotten to fill in some ugly gaps in the sides of the upper hull. I filled those in, touched up the paint and highlights and told myself I was a dumb, and then applied some patches of gloss varnish in preparation for decal time, which is now. I ended up only using one of the decals that came with this kit. The crosses and numbers were just too tall, though they would certainly work very well if the Scherzen was used on this tank. The one from the Warlord decal sheet is the division insignia, which in this case is the 2nd SS Panzer Division, I think. The larger crosses and the number on the back of the turret are from a Rubicon set, and the smaller crosses are from a Plastic Soldier Company sheet. Before some rivet counter starts blithering on about how the 2nd SS Panzer Division didn't mark their tanks in this way. I'm pretty certain that the markings are inaccurate. It doesn't matter. I just wanted them to look the part. After all, I'm no rivet counter, and in the end, I think they look fine. And that's what matters. Once the decals have set, I applied a matte varnish to them to prevent the following wash from beading up off the gloss. This wash is Army Painter Strong Tone mixed roughly 1 part Strong Tone to 2 parts water. I very roughly apply this all over the model. I try to avoid letting it pool up anywhere, though it will naturally be a bit heavier in all the cracks and recesses. That's kind of the point of this, though it does have the happy side effect of making the model look dirty in a fairly subtle way, and I feel like it's been quite effective on the grey here. Next, it's time for chipping. I'm obviously applying this with the usual sponge chipping method, which I have made a video about, link in the description and in the card in the upper right corner. I wasn't really sure how I wanted to do this. The normal colour I use for chipping is pretty close to the base colour here. One choice would be to use metallics, but I don't really like the shiny look of that, so I figured I would just try making a darker chipping mix. This is roughly 2 parts Vallejo Black Grey, 3 parts Model Color Mahogany Brown, and quite a bit of Vallejo Model Air Black, probably 7 or 8 parts. It's pretty thin, so that might be why I had to use so much of it. I tested this in a couple of patches on the whole bottom before applying it. This chipping colour still doesn't really stand out too much against the grey, but it is still there and you can see it. As usual, I use the same colour mix with a fine brush to apply some longer scratches. Again, kind of hard to see, but I do like that subtlety. It's most obvious across the decals, so I like to apply these scratches there. I also added along some of the edges of hatches and things like that where the foam didn't really hit. I was trying not to go overboard with the chipping and scratches, and the darkness of both the chipping and base colours has made it look like I succeeded there, though I did add a bit more chipping than I really wanted to. Now to paint some other bits. I pondered for a while on what to do with the tracks. I would normally paint them a grey colour like the base coats on this tank, and then follow it up with track wash. In the end, I decided to just leave them as they are, and then apply the track wash later as usual. However, I did paint the road wheels, and for this I used AK Interactive rubber tyres. This is simple enough, just put this colour onto the rubber bits of the road wheels. This colour isn't all that much different to the rest of the tank, but it is different enough I suppose. I had to do a couple of layers of this to get a nice solid coat. The paint is fairly thin out of the bottle. Also, don't forget to paint the spare road wheels. That is of course if your Panzer is carrying any. Next, I base coated the muffler in model colour Mahogany Brown. I feel like this is a good base colour for things like this that will be quite rusty. I tried to get this on as neatly as I could, but you can see that there are a couple of little spots of this on the surrounding areas. That's okay though, it can be cleaned up later. I then paint the jerry can using Vallejo German Camo dark green. Again, I tried to paint this carefully so that I don't have to repaint the holding bracket things that go across it. I've read that jerry cans were generally painted the same colour as the vehicle, but I wanted it to be a different colour just to add a little bit of interest. It is just a jerry can. The crew probably weren't super attached to the one painted with their tank, so maybe they swapped it for this one at a depot or something. Sometimes it's fun to make up stories for why things are the way they are on your models. I figured I probably wouldn't be painting anything else green, so I highlighted the can now. I added a tiny bit of buff to the green that I already had out, making a mix of roughly 40% buff to 60% green. As you can see, I'm applying this fairly roughly to the edges of the jerry can. Now for some wood. For my wood colour I'm using model colour Beige Brown. I apply it to the gun cleaning rods, or what I'm assuming are the gun cleaning rods, and of course I'm being pretty careful to avoid getting this onto the tank's hull. While it's okay to make mistakes, it's much nicer to avoid making them in the first place and not having to do extra work to clean things up. I also use this colour to paint the jacking block at the front left of the hull, again trying to be neat. I wanted to avoid painting the raised bar down the middle of this, but I wasn't quite able. Oh well, not really a big deal. I'll take care of it later. I also painted the handle of the axe. This is a bit fiddly owing to how close to the hull it is, but if you go slowly and carefully you can do it without getting the brown in places that you don't want it. Also, don't forget to add a spot of the beige brown at the top of the axe head where the handle is poking through a bit. Why not follow that up by painting the metal bits and pieces? I mean, other than the metal hull. You know what I mean. I start with the hull MG, and I apply a mix of roughly 1/2 Vallejo Model Colour Gunmetal and 1/2 Model Air Black. I quite liked the way this looks on previous models, so why not use it again? Once the gun is done, I move on to the fire extinguisher. I feel like this is probably also usually painted in the same colour as the hull, being painted with the hull, but I figure it might add a bit of interest having this another colour, just because. Then the track something tool, whatever it's called. This is a lot like the axe handle. It's very close to the hull, making it slightly tricky, but it's not too bad. Then the head of the axe. It makes sense that this would be metal, doesn't it? This isn't Minecraft where a stone axe will do. Then I paint the spanner. I wonder if this would be another thing that would be painted at the same time as the hull, and then be the same colour. I'm sure the paint would get worn off of that very quickly. I then paint the jack, which as you might imagine is fairly simple. And then there's a pair of poles or rods or something on the rear fender bits on either side of the tank. Then I decided it might be a nice idea to paint the ends of the gun cleaning rods. I'm pretty sure these have metal bits on the ends that allow them to screw together, so I figured that would be an interesting detail to add. I also use this colour to paint the bits that hold the jacking block in place. This is easy enough to do neatly, and it seemed like a good way to neaten it up after getting messy with the brown colour. Then I take some plain Vallejo Model Air Black and I paint it into the slots in the headlamps. Also the driver's vision slot. I figure this will give some depth and make them look nice. I also put this into the vision slots on the sides of the hull, and the slot in the side of the turret hatches. It's not too hard, just use a nice fine brush and go slowly. I painted the end of the gun cleaning rods with this colour too. I'm not sure what colour it should be, but this seemed like as good a colour as any. I also applied it to the antenna mount. I did consider adding an antenna with some fine wire or something, but at this scale and for a gaming piece I don't think it's really necessary. Now it's time for some highlights. I mix a little bit of buff with beige brown, roughly 1/4 buff to 3/4 beige brown, and I roughly apply it along the gun cleaning rods. I did the top rod fairly neatly, but the rest are a bit messier. I figure inconsistencies in this would give it more of a woody look than solid straight lines would. I also apply this to the edges of the jacking block. Obviously I'm being careful to avoid hitting the hull and bracket parts. I also apply a little bit of this mix to the upper surfaces of the axe handle. It's not perfect, there's a bit of roughness, but I feel that adds to the look of wood. Next, I take model colour gunmetal and highlight some of the edges of the various metal bits. I want to go very light with this. You may know that I'm not a fan of excess use of shiny metallic paints. Even though the matte finishing coat will dull everything down, I feel like it's still a good idea to not overuse metallics. I also use the same colour on the outer surfaces of the idler wheels where they contact the tracks and get worn to a shine. And I thought it might look good to apply this to the teeth of the drive sprockets too. Not a solid coating, just a kind of rough, patchy application mostly along the edges. Then I highlighted this end of the gun cleaning rod with AK Interactive tyres. I did this because at the same time I was applying another coat of this to the wheels, and it seemed like a good colour to use. Next, it's wash time. First, I made a mix of roughly 50/50 water and Army Painter soft tone, and I applied it to all of the wooden parts. I don't worry too much about being super neat with this because it probably won't be all that noticeable on the surrounding grey areas anyway. I think this makes the wooden parts look a lot better. Then I make a mix of roughly 50/50 dark tone and water. I apply this to the wheels, though it didn't really seem like it wanted to stick to the AK Interactive colour. That's okay, I suppose. I also put this on the muffler, going quite heavily on the exhaust pipe. This is to try and make it look like there's an opening there. I also use this in the vents on the engine deck. Unlike the other areas I've used this on, I'm trying to be kind of neat here, though I did spread it around a little bit on the engine deck as well. It's pretty thin, so once it dries it probably won't even be visible. Not when it's that thin. I let that dry, and then I figured I might as well apply a kind of highlighting around the rims of the road wheels. I used Vallejo Model Colour Basalt Grey and gently applied it all around the wheel rims. It doesn't have to be perfectly consistent and solid in colour, I just want to sort of break up the colour between the tyre and the front of the wheel. Of course, don't forget to do this on the spare road wheels too, if you've got any. This does a pretty reasonable job of breaking up the almost solid colour of the wheels and making the rims pop a bit. I guess this is a problem you face when just about everything on the tank is a very similar colour. Then, to try and further that effect, I applied undiluted dark tone in the recesses between the rims and the tyre rubber like so. I also added some in the bottom of the return roller rims too. Then I ponder if there's anything else I need to do. It's pretty basic, but I don't see anything else that needs doing, not with the acrylics anyway. So I apply a coat of gloss varnish to protect those acrylics, because now it's time for enamels. First, I add AK Interactive Enamel Track Wash. You might notice that I'm only applying this to the tracks. I know that's a weird thing to do with a track wash, but come with me on this adventure. It's actually not too bad a thing to get this onto the surrounding areas a little bit. You could blend it in and have it look like dirt or maybe rust, or you can easily remove it with a clean brush with some clean thinner on it. Not that it's especially tricky to keep it only on the tracks. Of course, don't forget to paint the undersides of the upper portions of track, just in case anybody looks there. Then I apply AK Interactive rust streaks to the exhaust. I do apply it fairly heavily, but I don't want it to be a solid coat, so I kind of stipple it a little bit so I get a patchy and inconsistent effect. Also, when I remembered to do the spare track links on the front of the hull, I stippled a little bit of track wash onto the exhaust as well. Next, I use some AK Interactive Paneliner, or as I like to read it, Paneliner. This is for brown and green camouflage, so it's probably not strictly the best colour to use here, but I like it so I'm going to use it here anyway. This is mostly to add extra dirt and darkness to gaps and lines around the edges of things like hatches and doors. It's not especially tricky to apply this, I just add it in or around the gaps that I want it in. Inevitably, it's going to be a little bit too much in some places, so I just take a clean brush with clean thinner on it and remove the bits I don't want. This can be done as many times as you want until you are satisfied with the result. I really like that about using enamels. I then stippled some tiny bits of AK Interactive Light Rust Wash onto the exhaust. I don't want too much of this on here because I feel like it looks a bit too bright. I follow that up with a final stippling of the rust streaks I used before. I feel like I've made an okay attempt at this kind of rust here. I then applied another coat of gloss varnish to seal those enamels into place. I didn't feel like much more was needed on this Panzer, but I figured a bit of dust might be nice. I applied AK Interactive Dark Mud, which was thinned roughly 50-50 with White Spirit. I spray this mostly at the bottom of the hull, from below. It doesn't matter if a little bit of this makes its way onto the upper surfaces of the model, in fact I deliberately spray some there to blend everything together a bit. This is quite a thin mixture and I mostly spray it from a long distance, so it does take a few passes to get the colour to build up, which is what I want. It's better to apply lots of thin coats until you're satisfied than one thick messy coat and not be satisfied with it, and then have to remove it. Then I take AK Interactive Summer Kursk Earth, and like the Dark Mud, I thin it roughly 50-50 with White Spirit too. I apply this in a similar way to the previous colour, but I apply a bit more of it to the upper surfaces. Still, I go very lightly with it. I don't want this to be a super dusty Panzer, but I do want it to look like it's being used. Then I applied some exhaust soot with an airbrush and black primer. I do this very carefully and use the control on the airbrush that restricts the trigger from going back too far. Still, I try to be careful with this. It would obviously be very infuriating to just spray a whole load of black all over the model after all that work. Then I applied a coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. As a finishing touch, I take a 2B pencil and rub the graphite onto some of the raised parts of the tracks. This adds a slight sheen at certain angles, without the over-the-top shininess of using a metallic paint. And with that, the Warlord Panzer IV has now been painted. And I'm pretty happy with it, though I think maybe I went a little bit too heavy with the dust. Still, it looks good to me. This is the first time for a long time that I've painted a grey Panzer, so next time I should be able to improve upon it, or at least apply a little bit less dirt and dust. I'm sure there's somebody out there that thinks I painted it the wrong colour. They're wrong because it's the colour I wanted it to be. I've seen Panzers in shades of grey a bit lighter than this, but I think it looks more menacing and imposing in a darker colour. There's not really a whole lot of colour variance on a grey Panzer versus one in a Dunkelgelb based camouflage pattern. I mean, most of the parts like the wheels and tyres and some of the tools are very close to the same colour as the body. The only things that are really different are the wooden parts, the exhaust and the jerry can. And the jerry can is only because I felt like painting it green would add a bit more variation. Still, I think it looks interesting and it should look pretty good on the tabletop. I'm hoping that the recipient of this tank likes it. I think I mentioned earlier that I painted this as a gift for somebody. If I didn't mention that, well, I guess I'm mentioning it now. Anyway, that's the reason I left the shirts off this model. And it's also the reason I painted it grey in the first place. I figured out those preferences and decided to paint the tank accordingly. The shirts and parts from this kit won't go to waste. I'm planning to use them as armor plating on a post-apocalyptic build, which seems like a good use for them. So other than this tank being something I haven't painted on video before, I don't think I've really done anything different or groundbreaking here. I think I did well, it's just nothing unusual, if that makes sense. Plenty of people have painted grey Panzer IVs before, but I do hope I've been able to help you with your own painting in some way, or at the least amused you for however many minutes this video ends up being. I'm pretty confident that anybody can paint a model to this standard. Maybe not on the first try, but if you keep painting, you'll keep improving. So go for it. If you're planning to copy my work exactly, or you just want suggestions for colours, there's a list of the paints I've used in the description. I do like to encourage people to make their own colour choices. You might prefer a slightly different shade of grey, and it's better to use the colours that you prefer for your own models. But it is of course perfectly fine to use the same colours that I did. I mean, I think they're pretty good choices, so why not? What do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.